She walked into the office glowing with news that should have been celebrated. She was pregnant. But instead of congratulations, she was fired on the spot. No warning, no explanation, just gone. What kind of company does that? Alone, jobless, and expecting she disappeared from their world, but she never forgot. And years later, when no one saw it coming, she returned, and what she brought with her left everyone speechless. This isn't just a story, it's a reckoning, and you won't believe how it ends. Before we jump in, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below, and get ready for a story you'll never forget. Emily Richardson had always believed in hard work. She wasn't born into wealth or privilege. Her parents were school teachers from a small town in Ohio, who taught her that success came from grit, persistence, and a good heart. After putting herself through community college and then transferring to a 4-year university while juggling waitressing jobs, Emily had finally made it. At 32, she landed a position as an office manager at a prestigious financial consulting firm in downtown Chicago. To her, it wasn't just a job. It was a doorway to everything she'd dreamed of. The building itself felt like a monument to her triumph, with its glass walls and polished marble floors. She remembered walking into the lobby on her first day, heels clicking confidently against the tile, a fresh folder of documents in one hand and her heart thudding with excitement. The company was fast-paced and demanding, but Emily thrived under pressure. She was efficient, organized, and always willing to go the extra mile. Within weeks, she had the respect of her team and the attention of upper management. Her boss, Mr. Harlan, a tall, sharp-suited man with ice-blue eyes, even complimented her during a company meeting. "She's one to watch," he'd said. Emily had smiled quietly, keeping her pride in check but feeling it bloom in her chest like sunlight through a window. Everything seemed to fall into place. Her apartment in Lincoln Park was small but charming. Her morning walks along Lake Michigan gave her peace, and her future seemed promising. Then came the news. A faint pink line on a drugstore pregnancy test. She stared at it for what felt like an hour, sitting on the edge of her bathtub, heart hammering. She and Nate, her boyfriend of 2 years, hadn't planned this, but he was, supportive when she told him, pulling her into a long hug and whispering that they'd figure it out together. Still, Emily worried. She knew how companies, especially ones like hers, quietly penalized women for becoming mothers. They wouldn't say it outright, but she had seen the signs in other places. Pregnant employees suddenly restructured, overlooked for promotions, quietly ushered out. She tried to keep it to herself, planning to wait until her second trimester before telling anyone. But morning sickness didn't wait, and neither did the fatigue. Her once flawless performance started to slip just barely. Missed emails here, a delayed report there, nothing serious but noticeable. One afternoon, as she rested her head on her desk during lunch, hoping to catch a few minutes of relief, her coworker Jenna walked in and closed the door gently. "Emily," she said softly, "are you okay?" Emily hesitated, then nodded. "I'm pregnant," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. Jenna's eyes widened but quickly softened into a smile. "Congratulations. Don't worry, I won't tell anyone," she promised. Emily smiled weakly, thankful for her kindness, even as unease crawled in her stomach. It didn't take long before the office started whispering. Jenna hadn't meant harm, but secrets had a way of slipping through the cracks, and soon, Emily felt eyes on her wherever she went. One Friday morning, she received a meeting invite from Mr. Harlan. The subject line was vague, just her name and the time. She tried to tell herself it was routine, maybe a performance review, maybe a new project, maybe even a promotion. But when she stepped into the conference room and saw HR sitting beside him, her stomach dropped like an elevator cable had snapped. Harlan didn't look her in the eye. The HR manager, a woman named Karen, handed her a folder. "We're having to make some budget adjustments," Karen said with rehearsed sympathy. "Unfortunately, your position has been deemed redundant." Emily's mouth went dry. "But I've been doing well. My numbers, my reports, everything." Karen shook her head gently. "It's not a reflection on your work. It's just a matter of restructuring. Emily turned to Harlan. Is this because I'm pregnant? She asked, her voice trembling. He blinked slowly, then looked away. Emily, he said flatly, we've made our decision. And just like that, the air in the room turned to ice. She packed up her things that afternoon in silence, her co-workers, awkwardly avoiding eye contact. The elevator ride down felt eternal. As she stepped out into the crisp Chicago air, her cardboard box clutched in her arms, the city no longer shimmered with promise. The wind sliced through her coat and rattled her bones, but it was nothing compared to the numbness spreading through her chest. Fired. Not because she couldn't do the job, but because she was having a baby. She was 32, pregnant and unemployed. Just like that, everything she had built came crashing down, not with a loud explosion, but with a quiet, cruel dismissal. She wandered to a nearby park bench and sat there for what felt like hours, watching the sun sink behind the skyline. Her phone buzzed with a message from Nate. How did it go? She couldn't bring herself to reply. How do you tell someone your entire life just got wiped clean like a chalkboard? All she could do was sit there frozen as the city moved on without her. The weekend after her termination passed in a fog, a hollow stretch of time marked only by swollen eyes and unanswered questions. Emily tried to keep calm for the sake of the baby, but the sting of betrayal made her stomach churn more than the morning sickness ever could. She sat curled on the couch in Nate's apartment, clutching a mug of chamomile tea that had gone cold hours ago. Nate did his best to console her, but his quiet rage toward the firm only made things harder. You should sue, he said again and again. This isn't legal. But Emily wasn't ready for a courtroom battle. She could barely find the strength to shower, let alone take on a legal war with a corporate machine armed with lawyers and fine print. She hadn't even told her parents yet, unsure of how to explain that the job she'd worked so hard to get had vanished because of the very life growing inside her. By Monday, the news had already traveled faster than she could have imagined. Jenna, the one co-worker she had confided in, sent a message that seemed well-meaning on the surface. I'm so sorry about everything. I didn't know Harlan would take it that way. I didn't mean for it to get around. Emily read the message 3 times before deleting it. The words settled like a heavy stone in her gut. She wasn't angry at Jenna, not exactly. But it was clear now that sharing her truth, even in whispers, had been a mistake. Trust, it seemed, was another casualty of her pregnancy. The betrayal felt more personal than the firing itself. She had opened up in a moment of vulnerability, and somehow that tiny truth had unraveled her entire career. The following days were filled with paperwork and polite rejections. Emily applied for unemployment, made a list of her monthly bills, and opened her laptop each morning like it was a lifeline. But with a growing belly and no steady income, the walls felt like they were inching closer every day. She reached out to a few former colleagues from past jobs, sent out resumes, even considered part-time administrative gigs, but every response was the same. We've moved forward with other candidates. No one said it, but she could feel the suspicion in their voices once they realized she was expecting. They didn't want someone who might need time off soon. She was, in their eyes, a liability. Meanwhile, the firm that had dismissed her kept moving like a machine. On social media, they posted about employee appreciation events and company growth milestones. It was like she had never existed. One night, unable to sleep, Emily scrolled through LinkedIn and saw a post by Mr. Harlan himself. A photo of the team at a charity gala, arms around each other, smiling brightly under twinkling lights. Her position had already been filled. A new name was listed on the company page, along with a glowing introduction. We're excited to welcome a fresh face to our leadership family, it read. Emily stared at the screen until the letters blurred. It wasn't just a job they'd taken from her. It was a piece of her identity. Bills began stacking up on the kitchen table like a house of cards. Nate picked up extra shifts at the restaurant where he worked, often coming home with blistered hands and tired eyes. He never complained, but Emily could see the toll it was taking. She began selling off things she didn't need. Old clothes, unused electronics, even her grandmother's antique watch. It hurt, but survival left little room for sentimentality. Every dollar counted. At her prenatal checkups, the nurses were kind, but the paperwork always asked for her employment status. Every time she checked the box marked unemployed, it felt like another blow to her pride. Her isolation grew thicker with each passing week. Friends she once texted daily began to drift. Invitations stopped coming. She understood. Most of them were busy climbing ladders in their own careers. They didn't know what to say to someone whose life had suddenly spiraled off course. Emily tried to stay strong for her baby. She read parenting books, watched videos on labor and delivery, and practiced breathing techniques in her living room. But every so often, she'd catch her reflection in the mirror and see someone she barely recognized. Tired eyes, shoulders weighed down by invisible burdens. She missed the woman she used to be, the one who had walked into that office with confidence, ready to build something meaningful. Still, even in her quietest despair, a small voice inside her kept whispering, "Not yet." This wasn't the end. This couldn't be the end. She thought of her mother, who had once worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. She thought of her father, who used to come home with chalk on his sleeves and joy in his voice no matter how long the day had been. Emily realized she hadn't lost everything. She still had her spirit, bruised though it was, and the tiny heartbeat inside her, reminding her that love was already growing in her life even as everything else fell away. One gray afternoon, Emily stood by the window, watching the city blur through a steady drizzle. She placed her hand on her belly and whispered, "We'll get through this, I promise." Outside, cars rolled by, strangers bustled with umbrellas, and somewhere in the distance a baby cried. But in that moment, with her hand cradling the curve of new life, Emily felt something stir that she hadn't felt in weeks. Not joy, not yet, but determination. The kind that roots itself deep and waits patiently to bloom. Winter crept in earlier than usual that year, wrapping Chicago in a cold so sharp it felt personal. Emily stood at the sink in Nate's apartment, watching her breath cloud against the window pane as she rinsed dishes with trembling hands. The heat had been temperamental for days, another thing they couldn't afford to fix right away, and she wore 2 pairs of socks and an old sweatshirt that barely stretched over her growing belly. Nate had left for work before sunrise, leaving, behind a kiss on her forehead and a promise to bring home dinner. Emily tried to smile as she remembered it, but the smile faltered. Something had shifted between them. At first it was subtle. Longer silences, distracted nods, the way he pulled away quicker when they kissed. But in the last few weeks it had grown more obvious, like a fraying rope unraveling one thread at a time. She didn't want to believe it, but denial was becoming harder to hold on to. Nate hadn't always been like this. When she first told him about the baby, he'd held her hand and made late-night grocery runs for pickles and peanut butter. He rubbed her back when the nausea hit and whispered jokes to make her laugh when she cried in the middle of the night. He was the one who told her everything would be okay. But now Emily often woke up to an empty bed, his side cold. He worked double shifts, sometimes without telling her, and when she tried to ask if something was wrong, he'd wave it off with a tired, forced smile. "Just tired," he'd say, before disappearing into the shower or scrolling silently through his phone. One evening, as the city groaned beneath a curtain of snow, Nate came home later than usual. Emily sat on the couch, a candle flickering beside her, and a casserole slowly cooling on the table. She had tried to recreate one of his favorite meals, hoping the familiar taste might bring him back to her in more ways than one. When he walked in, his jacket dusted with snow and his hair damp from the wind, she looked up with cautious hope. "Hey," she said softly, "you're home." Nate gave a distracted nod, then walked past her into the kitchen. He didn't even glance at the food. "I grabbed something on the way," he said over his shoulder. "Wasn't sure if you'd be up to cooking." Emily stood slowly. "I've been home all day. I made your favorite." He turned to her, eyes heavy. "I didn't ask you to." Her heart squeezed. "You didn't have to," she whispered, but he was already peeling off his jacket, tossing it over a chair. "I'm just tired, Em. Can we not do this tonight?" The words fell like ice cubes, each one colder than the last. She nodded and sat back down, blinking away the sting behind her eyes. They didn't speak for the rest of the night. The next morning, while Nate was in the shower, Emily heard his phone buzz on the counter. Normally, she respected his privacy, but something pulled at her, an intuition that had been quietly growing like a splinter under her skin. Her hands trembled as she picked up the phone. A name she didn't recognize flashed across the screen. Tina. Below it, a message lit up. "Last night was amazing. Wish we didn't have to sneak around." Emily's chest tightened, her vision blurring, as she put the phone down like it had burned her. She didn't cry. Not yet. She simply stood there, still as stone, as the water from the shower roared behind the door like a cruel laugh. When Nate came out, toweling his hair dry, she was sitting at the table, eyes fixed on him with a calmness that frightened even herself. "Who's Tina?" she asked. His hand froze mid-motion, towel suspended in the air. "What?" he said too quickly. "Don't lie," she said softly. "I saw the message." He opened his mouth, then closed it. The silence between them stretched out like a chasm. "It didn't mean anything," he finally muttered. "It was stupid, a mistake." Emily blinked slowly. "How long?" He hesitated. "A couple months." Her breath caught. "Since before I got fired?" He looked away, jaw clenched. "I didn't mean for it to happen. Things just got hard." Emily stood, her body heavy, her child shifting inside her like a wave. "You watched me fall apart," she said, voice low. "You watched me lose everything, and instead of standing by me, you found someone else." He stepped toward her. "I didn't plan it. I didn't stop caring about you." She shook her head, the room spinning. "But you stopped loving me," she said, more to herself than to him. He had no answer. Only silence. That night, Emily didn't sleep. She sat in the armchair by the window, wrapped in a blanket, watching the snow fall outside like ash. She thought about all the promises Nate had made, the dreams they'd shared, the baby they had created together. And she realized something painful but true. She was already raising this child alone. Whether Nate stayed or not, his heart had already left. By morning, she had made her decision. She didn't scream or throw things. She simply packed a small bag, gathered her important documents, and left a note on the table. "I deserve better. Our child deserves better. I hope someday you understand that." With her coat zipped up tight and her breath fogging in the cold, Emily stepped into the winter morning, belly heavy, heart shattered, but spine straighter than it had been in weeks. The betrayal had broken something inside her, but it had also ignited something else. A fire, a quiet vow. She wasn't going to let this be the end of her story. The air outside bit at Emily's cheeks as she walked through the slushy sidewalk, the early morning wind slicing through her scarf and coat. She had no plan, no destination, only the quiet certainty that she could no longer stay where she was. Her suitcase, small and worn, thumped along uneven pavement behind her as the world stirred slowly awake. A taxi passed her by without stopping. She didn't try to flag it down. For the first time in months, she wasn't looking to be rescued. She was looking to start over. As she walked through the neighborhood, familiar buildings faded behind her. The corner store where she and Nate used to grab snacks during late-night cravings. The bus stop where she'd once stood in a pencil skirt and heels, hopeful about her future at the firm. Each step away from them felt like shedding a skin that no longer fit. By the time she reached her sister's house on the far side of the city, her fingers were stiff with cold, and her legs ached with exhaustion. She hadn't spoken to Rachel in nearly a year, not because of any real falling out, but because life had swept them in different directions. Rachel had 2 kids, a husband who traveled often for work, and a calendar that always seemed full. Still, when she opened the door and saw Emily standing there with tear-brimmed eyes and a belly full of the only thing keeping her grounded, she didn't ask questions. She just pulled her into a hug that broke something loose inside her. And for the first time in weeks, Emily let herself cry. Not out of helplessness, but out of relief. Rachel made up the guest room while the kids ran around in mismatched pajamas, excited by the unexpected visitor. That night, Emily lay in the small bed, cocooned in fresh sheets, listening to the hum of life around her. Distant laughter from the living room, the sound of toys clattering against the floor. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't perfect, but it was warm, safe. And for now, that was enough. In the days that followed, Emily found herself falling into a rhythm. She helped Rachel with school drop-offs, folded laundry with the kids watching, cartoons beside her, and cooked dinner while Rachel caught up on work emails. It wasn't the career she had once envisioned, but it gave her something even more valuable in that moment: purpose. She applied for jobs again, but this time with a different mindset. No more pretending she wasn't pregnant. No more hiding behind carefully worded resumes or headshots taken months ago. She was done shrinking herself to fit into someone else's mold. With Rachel's encouragement, she even began exploring remote administrative roles and freelance writing gigs. Anything that would allow her to earn money without compromising the needs of her growing baby. One afternoon, she sent a pitch to a small parenting blog about her experience being fired while pregnant. She didn't expect much, but a week later she received a reply. They wanted to publish it. They even offered her a small stipend. It wasn't a fortune, but it was something. And more importantly, it was her voice, out there, being heard. The article was raw, honest, and unflinching. She told the truth about her former employer, the quiet discrimination, the way support had vanished the moment her pregnancy became real. She didn't name names, but the story resonated. Comments poured in, women sharing similar experiences, strangers offering words of solidarity, and even a few asking if she'd be willing to write more. One woman, a legal advocate based in New York, reached out privately to say, "If you ever want to take this further, you have a case, and I'd be honored to help you." Emily stared at the message for a long time, heart thudding. She wasn't ready to make that leap, not yet. But the idea sat there in the back of her mind, steady as a heartbeat. As weeks turned to months, her belly grew rounder, fuller, a constant reminder that something beautiful was coming even as everything else felt uncertain. She started walking in the park near Rachel's neighborhood every morning, bundled in layers, headphones in her ears, a podcast or soft music guiding her steps. Strangers would smile at her belly. Little kids would wave. Once, a woman stopped her to say, "You look so radiant, when are you due?" Emily smiled, touched by the unexpected kindness. "Early spring," she replied. "First one?" the woman asked. "Yes," she said softly, "but not my last, I hope." They shared a laugh, and for the first time Emily didn't feel like a cautionary tale. She felt like a woman stepping into her future. Rachel, ever the big sister, began making lists. "Things you'll need for baby," one read, taped to the fridge in looping cursive. They clipped coupons together on Sundays, hunted secondhand, cribs online, and turned the guest room into a tiny nursery nook with soft blue paint and glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. Emily didn't have much, but with every small step, every thrifted onesie and carefully folded blanket, she was building something. A home, a haven, a new chapter. And with every heartbeat that fluttered beneath her ribs, she knew one thing. For sure, this chapter would be hers to write, on her own terms, without fear, without apology. She wasn't just recovering anymore. She was becoming stronger, sharper, and more certain of her worth than she had ever been before. It was one of those gray mornings in early March when the sky hangs low and everything feels like it's holding its breath before spring dares to bloom. Emily was sorting through a small pile of mail Rachel had placed on the kitchen counter, most of it addressed to current resident or coupons from the local supermarket. She nearly tossed the whole stack into the recycling bin when her eyes landed on an envelope with her name handwritten in the corner. It wasn't from the doctor, or the parenting blog, or any of the remote job applications she'd sent in recent weeks. It was from Nate. The handwriting was unmistakable, slanted slightly to the right, the way he used to sign her birthday cards with a flourish at the end of her name. For a long moment she simply stared at it, fingers frozen above the paper like it might catch fire. Rachel walked in with a basket of laundry and raised an eyebrow. "You okay?" Emily gave a tight smile and slid the envelope under the rest of the mail. "Yeah, just junk." Rachel nodded, clearly sensing it wasn't the moment to press. As she left the room, Emily sat down slowly at the kitchen table, heart thudding. She didn't open the letter. Not that day. Not the day after either. She moved it from room to room, folding it into cookbooks, stuffing it behind picture frames, as if out of sight meant out of mind. But the truth was, the letter followed her, in dreams, in quiet moments during her morning walks, in the silence that crept in just before sleep. A week passed before she finally took it out again. She sat in the tiny nursery she'd pieced together, surrounded by soft blankets and thrifted toys. Her hand hovered over the envelope, hesitating. She had no idea what it might say. An apology, a plea, a confession. She wasn't sure which would be worse. In the end, she tucked it back into the drawer of the baby's dresser and stood up. Some things didn't deserve her energy, not anymore. Her life was no longer built around what Nate thought or felt. Her world had shifted, grown around the small heartbeat inside her and the community she was slowly rebuilding. She didn't need his words to know her worth. Instead of dwelling, she threw herself into finishing a new article. This one was about rebuilding life after betrayal, about learning to breathe again after the weight of someone else's choices had knocked the wind from your chest. She submitted it to the same parenting site that had published her first piece. 2 days later, they emailed her back. Not only did they want to publish it, but they asked if she would consider becoming a monthly contributor. The editor's note said, "You write with a rare honesty, Emily. People see themselves in your words." She read it 3 times before it sank in. For years, she had bent over backward to prove her worth in corporate America, trying to sound like someone she wasn't. Now she was finally being seen just by being herself. That evening, she told Rachel about the offer, and they celebrated with microwaved brownies and whipped cream straight from the can. The kids danced around the kitchen like it was New Year's Eve. Emily laughed so hard she cried, and when Rachel hugged her, she whispered, "You're doing it, Em. You're making something beautiful from the mess." And she was. Every article, every diaper she folded, every late-night thought scribbled into her notebook was a step forward. She wasn't the woman Nate had left behind. She wasn't the woman who had been fired and discarded. She was someone new, shaped by pain but not ruled by it. Still, on quiet nights when the wind whispered outside the windows and the stars blinked lazily above, the letter would creep back into her thoughts, not because she needed closure, not even because she missed him, but because a part of her still wondered what could drive someone to throw away so much so easily. But wondering and wanting were different things, and she no longer wanted anything from Nate. Not love, not explanation, not even regret. Then, on a Sunday morning, as the smell of cinnamon pancakes filled the kitchen and Rachel's youngest drew rainbows on the fridge with dry erase markers, Emily glanced down at her phone and saw a new email. The subject line made her breath catch. Feature story request. The New York Times. She opened it slowly. A journalist from their parenting and lifestyle section had read her latest article and wanted to profile her as part of a series on mothers overcoming workplace discrimination. Your story could help others speak up, the email said. If you're open to it, we'd love to talk. She sat down, heart racing, one hand over her belly as the baby kicked, like he too sensed the shift in the air. Emily didn't know what the future would hold. She still didn't have all the answers, and most days she was more exhausted than confident. But in that moment, she realized something that made her spine straighten. She had become a voice, not just for herself, but for every woman who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or pushed aside because of motherhood. She had turned her pain into power, and maybe that letter sitting in the drawer would stay unread forever. Because sometimes, moving forward meant choosing not to look back. It started with a phone call Emily nearly ignored. The number wasn't saved in her phone, and for a split second, she considered letting it go to voicemail like she had with so many others. But something made her answer. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the quiet confidence she'd slowly rebuilt over months of rediscovering her own voice. A woman's voice came through the line, calm, firm, with a hint of something powerful beneath the surface. "Ms. Carter, my name is Dana Carlisle. I'm a civil rights attorney specializing in workplace discrimination. I read your article about being fired for your pregnancy. I believe you have a case, and I'd be honored to represent you. Pro bono." Emily didn't respond right away. Her hand clutched the edge of the kitchen table as her mind tried to catch up with her heartbeat. She'd written those articles as therapy, not as ammunition. She hadn't expected this to become anything more than a way to survive. But now, as Dana's voice patiently waited on the other end of the line, Emily saw something she hadn't dared picture before. Accountability. She thought of the conference room where her boss had handed her that thin envelope, and the way his eyes had slid past her stomach like it was a problem too big to deal with. She remembered how small she'd felt leaving that building for the last time, how invisible. That memory alone made her voice steady as she said, "Yes, I want to move forward." The legal process was slow and grueling. Dana explained everything with precision, never talking down to her, never sugarcoating the reality. "It won't be easy," she said. "We'll have to prove it wasn't just a business decision. We'll have to show intent, bias, and retaliation. But your documentation helps. Your articles, the emails you saved, it's a strong case." Emily felt her nerves rattle at the thought of seeing them again, her former colleagues, her boss, the ones who had smiled to her face and then quietly erased her the moment she became inconvenient. But she wasn't the same woman they had dismissed. She was someone who had carried a child through heartbreak and humiliation, who had gotten up day after day when it would have been easier to fold. The depositions were the first true test. Emily wore a navy dress that barely stretched over her pregnant belly and walked into the law office with Dana beside her like a shield. The room smelled of paper and cold coffee. Across the table sat her former supervisor, Mr. Langley, his hair slicked back, his expression unreadable. He barely met her gaze. His attorney asked pointed questions. Was it true she had taken more time off than allowed? Had she ever expressed dissatisfaction with her job prior to being let go? Had she perhaps misunderstood the nature of her dismissal? Emily answered each one clearly, firmly, the truth sharp in her voice. No, she hadn't taken unauthorized time off. No, she hadn't been dissatisfied, until they showed her exactly how little she mattered to them. And no, she hadn't misunderstood. She had been fired because she was pregnant. Because she was no longer seen as useful. The case moved forward, and with it the public's attention grew. Her story had already gained traction online, but now reporters began to reach out. Local news outlets wanted interviews. Women across the country sent her messages, some short and grateful, others heartbreaking. "This happened to me too. Thank you for speaking up. I wish I'd had the courage." Emily read them late at night while her baby kicked gently inside her, reminding her of the stakes. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was standing up for something bigger, something that had long been ignored or brushed aside. Finally, the court date was set. Rachel helped her pick out an outfit that felt strong but soft, a pale gray blouse with sleeves that hugged her arms, a dark skirt that swayed gently when she walked. Dana stood beside her as they entered the courthouse, both women calm and collected beneath the high ceilings and marble floors. The opposing counsel argued that the company had been downsizing, that Emily's position was unfortunately redundant. But Dana countered with evidence. Emails that referenced her pregnancy in veiled language, meeting notes that hinted at concerns about maternity leave, patterns of treatment that echoed her story. Emily testified calmly, her voice never shaking. She told the truth, not just the facts, but the feeling of being cast out, of having her identity as a mother treated like a liability. when the judge announced that he would deliberate and return a ruling the following week. Emily felt the pressure finally ease from her chest. She had spoken, she had stood up, and whatever the outcome, she had reclaimed the part of herself that had once been too afraid to fight. That night, she sat on the porch with Rachel, the cool spring air brushing across her skin. The stars blinked above, quiet and watchful. "I didn't think I had it in me," she said softly. Rachel handed her a mug of warm milk. "You've had it in you all along. You just forgot for a while." Emily smiled, one hand resting on her belly as her baby shifted again, full of life and promise. She didn't know what the court would decide, but she knew she would never be the same. She had taken back her name, her strength, and her future, and that no matter what came next was a victory already won. The day the verdict came, the sky was a pale sheet of silver, hanging heavy over the courthouse like it too was holding its breath. Emily arrived early, her hands clasped in her lap as she sat on the bench outside the courtroom, trying to quiet the rhythm of her heart, which had become a loud, persistent drum in her chest. Dana arrived moments later, her briefcase in one hand, her free hand resting lightly on Emily's shoulder. "You did everything right," she whispered. "Whatever happens, they heard you. They had to look you in the eyes and listen." Emily nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She wasn't sure what she expected. Closure, maybe. Justice, hopefully. But deeper than that, there was something softer, more personal, validation, that the pain hadn't been imagined, that the betrayal hadn't been some overreaction, that her voice, for once, had been enough. Inside the courtroom, the judge's words came slowly, carefully measured. He acknowledged the complexity of the case, the nuances of employment law, the balancing act of business interests and civil rights. But in the end, the facts were plain. Emily had been let go at a time when her performance had been consistent, her evaluations positive. Her pregnancy had been viewed not openly but clearly as a problem. The judge ruled in her favor. Damages were awarded, both compensatory and punitive. A message had been sent. Emily didn't cry. She didn't shout or clap or throw her hands in the air. She sat still, her lips parting in a slow exhale as if her body had been waiting months for permission to breathe. Dana reached for her hand, squeezing it once, firmly. Across the aisle, her former employer's face remained stiff, unreadable, but she didn't need to see remorse. She had seen enough indifference to last a lifetime. What mattered was that the system, flawed as it was, had not looked away this time. When they stepped outside, the sunlight had finally broken through the clouds, painting the courthouse steps in a soft gold. Reporters waited near the base, microphones outstretched, voices calling her name. Emily paused, unsure. Dana leaned in and said, "You don't have to say anything you don't want to." But Emily stepped forward. She didn't prepare a speech. She didn't need to. Her voice was steady as she said, "I was fired because I was pregnant, because someone saw my motherhood as a burden, not a strength. But today, I stood up. Not just for myself, but for every woman who's ever been told she had to choose between a career and a child. We deserve better, and I hope this makes someone think twice before they do what was done to me." The crowd was quiet for a moment. Then the flurry of camera shutters and soft murmurs began again. But Emily didn't stay to answer more questions. She turned, walked down the steps with Dana beside her, and stepped into a different chapter of her life. One where her story wasn't just something that had happened to her, but something she had shaped, owned, and now shared with purpose. In the days that followed, her inbox overflowed. Women wrote to her from all over the country. Mothers, daughters, even fathers who had watched their wives suffer in silence. Some shared stories that mirrored her own almost exactly. Others simply thanked her for putting into words what they hadn't yet found the courage to say aloud. She read each message slowly, carefully, her heart expanding with each one. She wasn't alone. None of them were. And now, more than ever, she understood the power of being seen. Rachel organized a small gathering at the house the following weekend, a quiet celebration with close friends and neighbors. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon and apples. Laughter echoed from the backyard where the kids ran barefoot across the grass. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Emily let herself relax. She stood by the window, watching the sunlight catch in Rachel's hair as she flipped burgers on the grill and smiled. "You look lighter," Rachel said when she came in, handing her a glass of lemonade. "Like you finally laid something down you've been carrying too long." Emily nodded. "I think I finally believe I'm not broken. I never was. They just made me think I was." Later that night, after the house had quieted and the stars spilled out across the sky like scattered silver coins, Emily stood in the nursery, one hand resting on her belly. The verdict hadn't erased what happened. It hadn't undone the fear or the shame or the months of doubt, but it had given her something far more valuable, the knowledge that her voice mattered, that her story had weight, that she could face the world not as someone who had been discarded, but as someone who had stood back up. As she turned off the nursery light and slipped into bed, she felt the baby move, a slow, stretching roll beneath her skin, and smiled in the dark. This child, this journey, had given her so much more than she'd lost. It had brought her back to herself. And the woman she was now, stronger, wiser, and no longer afraid, was someone she was proud to be. The morning her water broke, it wasn't dramatic like in the movies. No sudden gush, no panicked rush. It was subtle, like a whisper from her body saying, "It's time." Emily had just finished folding the last of the tiny onesies when she felt the gentle shift inside her, followed by a steady rhythm that built slowly, surely, with the inevitability of a tide pulling toward shore. Rachel was the first to notice the difference in her breath, the way her voice caught in the middle of a sentence. "It's happening, isn't it?" she asked, already grabbing her keys. Emily just nodded, clutching the edge of the couch, eyes wide but focused. They drove through the early morning light, the street still sleepy and soft, the hospital looming ahead like a promise long awaited. Labor was long, fierce, and full of moments that stretched time thin. Emily had never felt pain like that before, but beneath it, stronger than the ache in her bones or the fire in her spine, was the knowing this was her purpose, her power. Hours passed in waves until, at last, a cry filled the room, and the nurse placed a warm, wriggling body against her chest. A girl. 10 perfect fingers. A wail that cut through the air like a declaration. Emily held her close, tears spilling silently as she whispered, "You were worth it. Every bit of it." They named her Grace. In the weeks that followed, Emily's world shifted entirely. Nights bled into days. Sleep came in fragments, and the smallest things like a yawn or a stretch or the way Grace curled her fingers around hers felt monumental. She didn't rush to return to writing, didn't answer every email, didn't check the news. For once, she let herself just be. Her story had gone quiet, but the world hadn't forgotten. When she opened her laptop again one afternoon while Grace napped, she found an email waiting in her inbox. The subject line read, "Your story deserves a bigger page." It was from a senior editor at a major publishing house who had followed her journey from the very first article and believed there was a book inside her waiting to be written, not just about your case, the message said, but about who you became through it. Emily stared at the screen, stunned. A book? She had never thought of herself as an author. Writing had always been a tool, a way to process and survive. But the idea lingered. What if her story could help someone else find their voice sooner? What if the long nights, the courtroom tension, the fear and the fire, all of it, could become something more than just memories? She called Dana first. "You should do it," Dana said without hesitation. "You have something to say and people are ready to listen." So she began. Not all at once. Not with bold chapters and big declarations. At first it was just a sentence here, a paragraph there, always in the slivers of quiet between feedings and diaper changes. She wrote about the first day she knew she was pregnant, about the fear, the shame, the lonely mornings where the world felt like it was passing her by. She wrote about Rachel's hands guiding her through the storm, about the articles that sparked a fire she didn't know she had, about the court, the verdict, and the moment she held Grace and knew her life would never be the same. The words came slowly but steadily, and with each one Emily felt a piece of herself return, not the version of her that corporate America had tried to shrink, but the truest version, forged in fire and sleepless nights and quiet strength. The publishing team was patient and encouraging. They loved her voice, her rawness, her refusal to gloss over the mess. They didn't want a tidy memoir. They wanted the truth. As winter melted into spring, the manuscript took shape. The title came late one night as she rocked Grace to sleep, whispering lullabies against the hush of the nursery. She wrote it down in the Notes app on her phone, more than enough. It was what she had felt she wasn't when they let her go. It was what she now knew she had always been. When she submitted the final draft, there was no fanfare, no celebration, just a quiet moment between her and the screen, a small smile as she pressed send. Months later, the book hit shelves and the response was immediate. Book clubs across the country chose it for discussion. Podcasts invited her to speak. Women approached her in grocery stores and cafes, holding worn copies in their hands, eyes full of gratitude. She even got a call from a university professor who wanted to include it in a women's studies curriculum. Emily handled it all with humility and grace, never forgetting where she'd come from, never letting the spotlight dull her sense of purpose. And through it all, Grace grew, chubby-cheeked and bright-eyed, curious about the world her mother had fought so hard to re-enter. Night. After reading a fan letter from a woman in Michigan who had just won her own discrimination case, Emily closed her eyes and let the moment settle. Her pain had been real. Her struggle had been brutal. But now, it was something more. It was a beacon. And as Grace babbled beside her, reaching for the pages of a book that bore her mother's name, Emily knew she had done something extraordinary. She had turned her worst day into someone else's first step. And that, more than any verdict or book deal, was the victory she would treasure most. The first time Emily stood in front of a conference room again, she felt her knees tremble. Not from fear, but from the weight of everything that had come before. The long months of silence, the humiliating exit, the nights when she doubted she'd ever be seen as more than a cautionary tale. But now here she was, not as an applicant or a desperate woman hoping someone would give her a second chance, but as a guest speaker invited to address a room full of executives, HR managers, and business leaders about corporate responsibility, workplace inclusion, and the high cost of quiet discrimination. She looked out over the polished tables and name-tagged professionals and drew a long, steady breath. Her return to the professional world hadn't happened overnight. After the book's release, Emily had been inundated with offers, media appearances, panel discussions, mentorship programs. She was hesitant at first. Her world had shrunk so beautifully into her home with Grace that the idea of stepping back into the corporate buzz felt distant, almost foreign. But then came the invitation from a well-known human resources conference in Chicago. They didn't just want her story. They wanted her insight, her perspective, her ideas for change. That part struck something deeper than pride. It touched purpose. So she said yes. Rachel flew in with her and stayed with Grace at the hotel while Emily prepped her talk. She spent hours fine-tuning her words, not because she wanted to impress, but because she knew this room. The same kind of room where once, years ago, men in suits decided she was expendable. Now she had a chance to reshape what rooms like that could be. Her talk began not with facts or charts, but with a simple moment. The morning she was told she was no longer needed. She described the tight smile on her manager's face, the way his words were wrapped in corporate softness, and how even before he finished speaking she had known. She spoke of the silence that followed, the lawsuits, the media attention, and the child who had become the cornerstone of everything. But then she pivoted. She didn't want their pity. She wanted their reflection. She talked about how policy alone wasn't enough, how change came from culture, from the unspoken messages leaders send when they promote, when they protect, when they listen, or don't. The room was quiet as she spoke, not out of disinterest, but the kind of stillness that comes when people realize they're being held accountable by someone who has nothing to lose. When she finished, there was a pause, a breath held collectively, and then the room erupted into applause, not polite, obligatory clapping, but real, resonant appreciation. Several people came up afterward, shaking her hand, some with tears in their eyes. A woman in her early 40s said, "You just told my story. I've never been able to say it out loud before." Another said, "My company needs you. Would you come speak to our leadership?" What began as one event became a dozen. Emily carefully chose which invitations to accept. She wasn't looking for fame. She had no desire to become a corporate mascot for women's empowerment. What she wanted was genuine impact. She met with startup founders, legacy corporations, women's groups, and college students. Everywhere she went, she listened as much as she spoke. She realized how many people, especially women, were still quietly enduring what she had barely survived. But now she could give them a language for their pain. And more than that, a path forward. Eventually, a former colleague reached out, a woman named Jenna, who had stayed at the same company long after Emily's exit. She was now leading a diversity and equity task force and wanted Emily's help reworking their maternity leave policies. "I know," Jenna had said quietly. "We should have done more. I should have spoken up. I'm sorry I didn't then, but I want to do it right now." Emily paused before answering. She had sworn she would never walk back through those doors, never lend her insight to a place that once discarded her without a second glance. But something had shifted. She wasn't going back as an employee. She was going back on her terms, as a consultant, as a mother, as a woman who had built something lasting from the rubble they left her in. She agreed. When she walked through those familiar glass doors months later, the receptionists greeted her by name. People whispered in the hallways, unsure whether to make eye contact, unsure if she remembered them, if she blamed them. The truth was, she didn't. Not anymore. She wasn't there to relive the past. She was there to rebuild what the past had broken. In a conference room not unlike the one where she'd been dismissed, she sat at the head of the table, presenting a new vision for parental leave, caregiver flexibility, and employee protection policies that actually protected. The irony wasn't lost on her. But this time she didn't feel like an outsider. She felt like a catalyst. Afterward, Jenna hugged her and said, "I wish we had listened to you then." Emily smiled. "I wish I had spoken louder, but we're here now, and that matters." As she left the building, stepping out into the afternoon sun, she called Rachel. "I did it," she said. "Not just the speech. I went back." There was silence on the line for a beat. Then Rachel said softly, "And did it feel like victory?" Emily looked up at the sky, full of soft blue and moving clouds, and answered, "It felt like peace, and maybe that's even better." After months of speaking engagements, consulting work, and helping to revise outdated policies, Emily began to feel a quiet tug deep inside, a feeling she hadn't fully noticed until one quiet morning as she sat on the back porch with a cup of coffee in hand and Grace playing with sidewalk chalk nearby. The air was crisp with early spring, the scent of fresh earth rising in the breeze, and for the first time in a long while, Emily didn't feel like she was reacting to life. She felt ready to create. The thought came as gently as the wind, but with the firmness of a calling. What if she didn't just advise companies? What if she built something of her own? The idea started small. She envisioned a local space where women like her, mothers, professionals, survivors of career injustice could find support, resources, and perhaps most importantly, each other. A place where no one would be dismissed because of pregnancy or caregiver responsibilities. A place where policies weren't just printed on glossy handbooks, but actually lived in daily practice. She spoke to Rachel about it first, and Rachel, ever the pragmatic cheerleader, simply said, "It's about time." Emily began by mapping out what this center could look like. Not just a co-working space or daycare, but a hub, a community. She imagined rooms for mentorship programs, workshops on navigating workplace discrimination, small offices for legal aid and career counseling, and a bright, welcoming space for kids to learn and grow while their parents did the same. She called it the Reclaim Project, a name that spoke to what so many women had lost and what they could now take back. She reached out to a few of the women she had met at past conferences, HR leaders, attorneys, nonprofit directors, and pitched the vision. At first, she expected polite nods and vague promises of support. But what she received instead was unfiltered enthusiasm. One woman offered to help with grant writing. Another had space available in a community center downtown. A third knew, a foundation that funded initiatives just like this. Emily was stunned. For so long, she had lived in the shadow of being dismissed, doubted, and overlooked. Now people were showing up not because they pitied her, but because they believed in her. The hardest part wasn't the logistics. It was the vulnerability. For every step forward, there were whispers of doubt. Would anyone come? Would anyone trust her vision enough to walk through the door? But she pushed through day by day, fueled by Grace's giggles in the next room, and the memory of how alone she once felt sitting in her car, jobless and pregnant. She never wanted another woman to feel that kind of aloneness. Opening day arrived on a sunny Saturday, with balloons at the front door and fresh flowers on every table. Rachel stood beside her, beaming with pride, and Grace, now 4 years old and curious as ever, clung to her hand. Emily stood near the entrance, welcoming each guest like they were entering her home. Some were new faces, drawn by the buzz on social media and community flyers. Others were familiar, women she had mentored, women who had read her book, women who had emailed her late at night sharing their stories and hoping for a different ending. And here, at the Reclaim Project, was the beginning of one. There were tears that day. There was laughter, too. In one corner, a young woman read aloud from a children's book while toddlers listened wide-eyed. In another, 2 women swapped stories of being pushed out of tech jobs after announcing pregnancies. Emily floated between groups, not needing to control the moment, only witnessing the beautiful chaos of community blooming. When someone asked where her office was, she simply smiled and said, "Right here," gesturing to the open space full of warmth and movement. She didn't want walls. She wanted connection. Word of the center spread quickly. Local news outlets covered it. Donations came in from strangers moved by the mission. More than anything, Emily cherished the messages. Short notes scribbled on the comment wall they set up in the hallway. One read, "I walked in here today scared. I'm leaving with hope." Another said, "This place gave me back my voice." And though she hadn't planned on it, Emily began offering a monthly talk, an open circle where anyone could share or simply listen. No microphones, no stages, just stories. And every time someone cracked open a memory they had hidden for years, Emily knew the real work was happening. It wasn't in the polished statements or press coverage. It was in the way women leaned into each other, offered comfort, and reminded one another they weren't alone. One evening, as the center quieted, and Grace fell asleep on the couch with a blanket over her, Emily sat with Rachel near the big picture window. The sun was setting, casting gold across the hardwood floor. "Can you believe this?" Emily whispered. Rachel nodded, tears in her eyes. "You didn't just come back, Em. You built something better than what they ever gave you." Emily looked out at the dusk settling over the town, her heart full in a way she never thought possible. She hadn't just survived what they did to her. She had reclaimed her power, her voice, and her purpose, and she'd opened the door for so many others to do the same. The early days of the Reclaim Project felt like watching seeds bloom after a long, cold winter. Emily had found her rhythm, her purpose, and even a new kind of peace. But life has a way of knocking when you least expect it, and often when you think the past is long buried. It began one Thursday afternoon when a letter arrived in a plain white envelope, hand-addressed, no return name. She opened it casually while sipping her tea, not expecting anything unusual. But her heart stumbled as she read the first line. Dear Emily, I don't know if you remember me. My name is Karen Lewis. I used to be your supervisor at Avalon Financial. Her fingers froze. The name hit her like a sudden wind on a warm day, unexpected, jarring, and full of memories she'd rather have forgotten. Karen had been the HR director who called her into that cold room years ago, the one who delivered the blow with practiced detachment, saying words like, "We're sorry," and "not the right time," as if they weren't dismantling a woman's future. Emily read on, her breath shallow. I've thought about you more times than I can count. What happened was wrong, deeply wrong. I didn't have the courage to stand up to the leadership then, and I've regretted it every single day since. I'm writing to ask if I might come speak to you in person. There's something I'd like to say face to face. She set the letter down slowly, emotions swirling. Anger, disbelief, curiosity, even a hint of something more complicated, like pity. She hadn't thought of Karen in years. After that day, she had erased the faces of those who wronged her, choosing to focus on building instead of looking back. But here it was, the past resurfacing, polite and penitent, asking for space in her present. Rachel was the first person she called. As always, Rachel listened quietly, then said, You don't owe her anything, Em, but maybe this is about closure. For you, not for her. Emily didn't answer right away. That night, as she watched Grace sleep, curled against a stuffed bunny, she remembered how lost she'd felt back then, walking out of that glass building jobless and pregnant, told she was too much of a liability. She had survived. She had rebuilt. But there was still a bruise there, even if time had faded the color. The next morning, she wrote back with a single sentence, You can come by the Reclaim Project on Friday at 3 p.m. She didn't sign it with warmth, but she didn't shut the door either. Friday came too quickly. The center buzzed with its usual energy, toddlers playing, volunteers laughing, women gathering in circles of shared strength. But in her heart, a knot tightened. At 2:58 p.m., Emily stepped into the quiet meeting room, the one with the soft chairs and the bookshelf of titles about resilience and courage. She wanted the setting to be kind, even if her emotions weren't. At 3:01, the door opened. Karen stepped in, older than Emily remembered, her once meticulously styled hair now streaked with gray, her eyes carrying a weight that didn't exist before. She held a small notebook in her hands and looked unsure of how to begin. Thank you for seeing me, Karen said softly. Emily nodded once. Silence hung between them, thick and charged. Karen sat folding her hands. I won't take much of your time, Her voice caught and she paused. I've lived with guilt. Every year, every time I saw a news story about workplace discrimination, I thought of you. When my daughter got pregnant at 24 and nearly lost her job, I thought of you. And when I saw your name on the news last month when the Reclaim Project made headlines, I knew I had to say something. Emily said nothing. She wanted to hear it all. Karen went on, her voice trembling. I was scared. That's the truth. I let fear guide me instead of doing the right thing. I told myself I had no choice, but I did. I just didn't want to lose my job, my status. And now I see that I helped destroy something in you that day. You deserved better. Emily studied her, not with bitterness, but with something colder. Clarity. I did deserve better, she said evenly. You could have stood up for me, but you didn't. Karen nodded, her eyes glossy. I know, and I'm sorry. I know sorry isn't enough. But I had to say it to your face, and tell you, what you've built is extraordinary. You turned pain into purpose. That's rare. There was a long silence. Emily felt something shift. Not forgiveness exactly, but the release of a weight she hadn't known she still carried. Thank you for saying that, she said. But this center isn't about me being extraordinary. It's about women not having to be. Karen stood slowly, placing the notebook on the table. I wrote, "A statement," she said. "If you ever want to use it for awareness, legal reform, anything, it's yours, no restrictions." She walked to the door, then turned back. "I hope someday you find peace with what happened. You deserve that too." And then she was gone. Emily sat alone for a long while, staring at the little notebook on the table. She didn't open it right away. She simply breathed, deeply, fully, for the first time in what felt like years. Emily never imagined that a modest community center in a quiet town could catch the attention of people in Washington, but that's exactly what happened. It started with a single article published by a journalist who had visited the Reclaim Project on a whim. The piece, titled "Where Courage Lives: One Woman's Mission to Reclaim Dignity," was shared by a few hundred readers at first, then thousands, and by the end of the week it had gone viral. The phones at the center rang nonstop. Requests for interviews poured in. Messages from women across the country filled their inboxes, some thanking her, others sharing stories so heartbreakingly similar that Emily sometimes sat in silence after reading them, just trying to breathe. What struck her most were the ones from young women in corporate jobs afraid to speak up, terrified of the consequences of pregnancy in a world still unkind to working mothers. She remembered those fears intimately. Then came the call from Congresswoman Linda Ramirez, a strong-willed advocate for women's rights who had been pushing for updated protections for pregnant workers. "Emily," she said during their first phone call, "we need voices like yours in the room. Real stories. Lived truth. Would you consider coming to Washington to speak?" Emily's heart skipped. The idea of speaking in front of policymakers was daunting. She had no political background, no legal training, just her story and the scars to prove it. But Rachel, as always, gave her courage. "They need to hear from someone who's lived it, not just studied it. This is bigger than us now." So she said yes. A few weeks later, Emily stood outside the Capitol building, nerves dancing like fire in her veins. She wore a navy blue dress Grace had picked out, her hair pulled back simply. She wasn't trying to impress. She just wanted to be heard. Inside the committee room, the air was thick with formality. The faces of lawmakers lined the long table, some attentive, others distracted, but Emily focused only on her purpose. When her name was called, she walked to the microphone, placed her palms flat on the table, and began. She didn't read from a script. She spoke from the same place she had built the Reclaim Project from: pain, strength, and an unwavering belief that no woman should have to choose between motherhood and dignity. She told them about Avalon Financial, about the day she was fired, while carrying her unborn daughter. She described the hopelessness, the fear, the nights spent crying in a one-bedroom apartment, and the slow journey back to self-worth. She told them about the center, about the women who came in shattered and left with fire in their eyes, about the jobs they now held, the babies they raised in peace, the lives reclaimed. And then she paused. "I didn't come here for sympathy," she said, her voice steady. "I came here because I don't want another woman to sit where I sat, alone, pregnant, and discarded like I didn't matter. We can't keep saying we value family and then punish the people who create it." The room was silent when she finished, not out of politeness, but reverence. One lawmaker wiped her eyes, another cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. But the message had landed. Over the next few days, Emily joined panels, spoke to journalists, even met with the Department of Labor. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a catalyst. The stories she shared weren't just hers, they belonged to thousands of women, and now they had a voice in rooms that mattered. One morning, while sipping coffee in a quiet corner of the congressional lounge, she was approached by a young staffer who said, "You reminded me why I took this job. My mom raised me alone. She was fired when she got pregnant too. I just wanted to say thank you." Emily smiled. These were the moments she hadn't expected. Not the media, buzz, or the press photos, but the quiet acknowledgments from people who were listening, not with curiosity, but with memory. By the time she flew back home, tired but filled with a new kind of hope, She found a banner hung at the center by the women she served. In bold painted letters it read, "Our voice reached Washington because of you." She stood in the doorway, Grace by her side, and let herself feel it fully. Not pride exactly, but completion. A circle drawn from injustice to impact. And while policy change would take time, she knew the first stone had been thrown. There was movement now. There was momentum. And there was her, a woman once discarded, now shaping the future one voice at a time. It was a gray Thursday morning when Emily received the letter, the kind of morning where the sky looked like it couldn't make up its mind whether to rain or simply linger in indecision. She had just finished a workshop at the center, her hands still smelling faintly of dry erase markers and coffee, when Sarah, one of the volunteers, walked in holding a white envelope. "This was dropped off just now," she said, handing it over. There was no return address, only Emily's name handwritten, neatly on the front. Something about the handwriting, elegant, deliberate, made her pause. She took it to her office and sat down slowly, staring at it for a full minute before finally sliding her finger beneath the flap. The letter inside was typewritten, a single page, crisp and without signature. The first few words made her breath catch. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve your attention, but I owe you this." She read on, heart pounding, as realization dawned. It was from Daniel, the former executive from Avalon Financial. Her former boss. The man who had signed off on her termination the week after she announced her pregnancy. The man who had never looked her in the eye afterward. The man who disappeared from her world as quickly as he had destroyed her career. He wrote of guilt, not in the dramatic, begging for redemption kind of way, but with the quiet honesty of someone who had carried a burden far too long. He admitted what she had always suspected but never confirmed, that her firing wasn't about performance or budget. It was about optics, about pressure from the board, about a culture that saw expectant mothers as liabilities instead of leaders. "I watched it happen," he wrote. "I let it happen. And then I walked away, telling myself it was just business. But it wasn't. It was cowardice." Emily stared at the paper, her hands trembling. He went on to describe how he left the company 2 years later. Not because of her, he admitted, but because of something his daughter said at dinner one night. She was 10 years old at the time and had asked him, "Daddy, do you help people with your job?" He couldn't answer. That silence unraveled everything. He left the job, divorced soon after, and began volunteering at a nonprofit helping displaced workers. It was there, he said, that he began to see faces that reminded him of hers. Young women, hopeful and afraid, trying to rebuild after being broken by systems they couldn't control. "And then I saw your name," the letter continued, "in an article someone forwarded to me, about the center, about the women you're helping. I realized you didn't just survive. You transformed. You became everything I should have been brave enough to stand for." By the time she reached the last paragraph, Emily had stopped blinking, tears slipping down her cheeks without resistance. The final lines weren't poetic or flowery, just stark and raw. "I don't expect you to respond. I just needed you to know I remember. And I am sorry." She folded the letter slowly and held it in both hands, staring at the blank wall in front of her. Her mind raced with memories, the humiliation, the fear, the months of uncertainty. But beneath that, something else stirred. Not forgiveness, not yet, but closure. That night, she didn't talk about the letter to anyone, not even Rachel or Grace. She sat in bed long after the house went quiet, the letter beside her, and let herself feel every single thing it brought back. Anger, relief, a strange kind of peace. In the morning, she went to the center early, before the doors opened, before the city woke up. She pinned the letter to the inside of her office closet door where no one else would see it. It wasn't a trophy, and it wasn't a wound. It was a reminder that even the people who hurt you might carry their own shadows, and that sometimes the justice you seek isn't found in a courtroom or a headline, but in the quiet confession of someone who finally saw the truth. She stepped out into the hallway just as the first woman of the day walked in, a young mother holding a toddler on one hip and a resume in the other. Emily smiled and welcomed her warmly, because that was her work now, not looking back, but opening doors for others. And though the past would always be a part of her, she had learned to carry it without letting it define her. The letter had given her something she didn't expect, not just validation, but a kind of release. A chapter, closed not with vengeance but with clarity. And with that, she stepped forward into the day, ready to write the next one. The spring air held a kind of promise that morning, the kind that wraps around you like sunlight on skin just warming from a long winter. Emily stood at the edge of the new property, a modest brick building on the east side of town, once a shuttered elementary school now glowing with fresh paint and the buzz of something beginning. A soft breeze stirred the grass at her feet, and she could hear the laughter of children in the temporary daycare center behind her. For a long moment, she simply stood still, taking it all in. The fluttering banner that read Women's Hope Resource Campus, the rows of donated books being stacked on handmade shelves, the busy energy of women and volunteers who moved through the space as if it had always belonged to them. But it hadn't. Not long ago, it was just a dream, a whisper, a stubborn hope she refused to let go of. Now, it was real, and it was hers. Rachel walked up beside her, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. She handed one over and gave a small, knowing smile. "You still doing that thing where you pause before every milestone?" Emily laughed softly, her eyes still locked on the building. "It's not about the milestone. It's the miracle." Rachel nodded, her face suddenly softer. "You've built something that's going to outlive you, Em. That's not just legacy. That's impact." Emily sipped her coffee, letting the words settle deep inside her. Legacy. She had never thought of herself in such grand terms. She was a woman who had once been fired for being pregnant, who had stood at the edge of ruin with a baby in her arms and a future made of dust. But from that dust, she had built something unshakable. Not alone, never alone, but with grit and grace in the sheer force of choosing to get up every time she was pushed down. Inside the building, final touches were being made for the grand opening gala that evening. Local politicians were expected to attend. Sponsors from across the country had flown in. There were speeches to give, ribbons to cut, photos to pose for. Emily had written and rewritten her remarks a dozen times, never quite finding the words. That felt true enough. But now, standing here, she realized the speech didn't need to be polished. It needed to be real. She would tell them the truth, that this place wasn't about charity. It was about justice. That every woman who walked through those doors deserved more than second chances. They deserved to never be counted out in the first place, and she would speak for them, with them, not as a savior but as a survivor who had once nearly drowned in silence. Later that evening, dressed in a navy blue dress borrowed from Grace, her hair swept back and her heart steady, Emily stepped onto the small stage set up in what used to be the school's library. Faces turned toward her, some familiar, many new. Women who had been part of the journey and men who had helped sponsor it. She took a breath. 10 years ago, she began, I was told that becoming a mother made me less valuable in the workplace, that my future was too uncertain to bet on, that the life growing inside me somehow made me a risk. She paused, letting the words echo. But that risk turned into the greatest reason I've ever had to rise. And I stand here not in spite of what happened, but because of it. Because I believed, I had to believe, that what broke me could also build me. She saw tears in the eyes of women in the front row, nods from across the room, and in that moment she knew the words had landed. After the applause, after the lights dimmed and the gala faded into conversation and handshakes, Emily stepped outside alone. The stars above were clear, scattered like old friends, and for the first time in a long while she allowed herself to look back without pain. Her daughter Grace, now 14, had spoken during the event too. Just a few short sentences, but with the poise and confidence of someone raised in a home where truth was never hidden. Emily remembered holding that baby girl all those years ago, rocking her through the night, wondering how she'd feed her, clothe her, make it through one more day. And now here she was, radiant, sharp, compassionate. The living proof that no path is too broken to build on. She didn't know what the next chapter would look like. Perhaps this campus would grow into something even bigger. Perhaps it would inspire other women in other towns to start their own centers. Perhaps it would be a model for what support could truly look like when driven by dignity rather than pity. Or perhaps it would simply stand as it was, a safe haven, a place of beginning, a space where women learned not just to survive, but to reclaim their lives piece by piece. Emily looked up at the building one last time before heading home. Its lights glowed against the evening sky, warm and alive, and deep in her bones, she felt it, that unshakable truth she had carried all along, even when no one else had believed. She was never too small to matter, never too weak to rise, and never, not once, defined by the people who underestimated her. And so, from a moment of heartbreak to a lifetime of purpose, Emily's story reminds us that sometimes, life's greatest gifts are born from our deepest trials. If you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or pushed aside, let this be a gentle reminder. You are never out of chances, and your worth isn't measured by anyone else's opinion. Your story still matters, and your next chapter could be the one that changes everything. Thank you so much for watching and listening all the way through. We're truly grateful to have you here with us. If this story touched your heart or made you think of someone you love, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps more people find it. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss a new story that might just speak to your soul. And we'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts or your own story in the comments below. We read everyone, and your words might be the encouragement someone else needs today. Until next time, take care, stay kind, and never stop believing in the power of a second chance.